Okay, Patty, I have a couple more questions for you. Is is there anything about being a teenager that makes you more likely to commit suicide than the same person is likely to commit suicide when they're, say, like 30 or 35 years old? Is there something about teenageness that's its own suicide risk?
Um, so I don't remember the statistics exactly, but I do think actually that fewer teens actually commit suicide than young adults, if I remember my statistics accurately. Having said that, though, I think that something that does increase risk of suicide in teens is their impulsivity. So just it's the nature of being a teenager to be somewhat impulsive and less risk averse than older adults or younger children. So in, as far as I know, and in my opinion, that's the only increased risk factor.
Do you think, I was jotting out when you said that, it made me think of something. I started jotting down a note. Uh, do you think it increases risks if kids are like reading books or watching movies or listening to music that kind of glorifies suicide? I've read some young adult fiction recently that I felt like almost romanticized suicide. And I wondered if teens had the maturity to realize, just because this made a cool book and just because everybody in the school showed up for the funeral and isn't that cool doesn't make it a good idea.
Um, so again, I'm gonna guess that it only increases risk in someone who is already thinking about it.
Okay.
Actually, I don't, there's so many topics about in books and all kinds of media, right? That I don't imagine that exposure to media itself actually influences people to do that much. It's more about are we seeking out media that's going to reinforce what we're already feeling or thinking. That may make it look like it influences us, but we're actually seeking out what we're already attracted to.
So if I'm a teacher and I'm at a school or in a district where there has been suicide near me, should I talk about it more with kids? Should I talk about it less with kids? Should I avoid reading stories in English class that have suicide, or should I read them so I can have discussion?
Um, I would, so the basic rule that I use with kids of all ages is to gently introduce a topic, like say, some so-and-so in whatever district or class or whatever, like the kids know what's going on, right? So just like open it up, acknowledge that you're aware of it too. This happened. But then follow their lead. So you allow the space for the topic, but then answer questions or, create a discussion that's what they want to talk about. So I wouldn't necessarily create curriculum around it, like, using a book, but I also wouldn't avoid, like if you have in your curriculum already a book that has that topic in it, I wouldn't say, oh, we can't do that now. I would carry on with the normal curriculum and let nature take its course as far as the conversations that happen.
It sounds a little bit like talking about kids about the birds and the bees.
Exactly. Yeah, it's the same thing. At any topic, I think, we need to have conversations with kids about the birds and the bees and suicide and domestic violence and trauma and, all kinds of world events, war and, the horrible things, school shootings, things that happen. We need to have these conversations with kids, but we need to let it be driven by them and not by what we think we need to
know. Are there certain mental health conditions that teens might have that would make them more prone to suicide? Because these are things that sometimes teachers have access to. Like sometimes if a student's been diagnosed with a mental health issue that affects school, we might know about that because they might have a 504 accommodation or a behavior intervention plan. If they have a mental health condition that isn't creating school impairment, we might not know. But because there wouldn't be any record of it in the school, And sometimes you get situations where a parent doesn't want the school to know about something, but and mental health professionals, obviously, as you know, they can't just call the school and say to the teacher, you know, because of HIPAA, they can't call us and say, oh, by the way, you've got a kid in your class who's a really high suicide risk, right? But are there some mental health conditions that are more likely to result in a suicide attempt or completed suicide than others? So if we see a kid who it says has like, well, I was going to say schizophrenia, but that's going to be less common as a diagnosis in the kids that we're working with, just because it's less commonly diagnosed in younger people, but until they're probably out of high school. But what about like depression, that kind of thing?
Well, it's tricky. So I think depression and trauma are the greatest risk factors, but I think most people are misdiagnosed. So I think it's pretty common to go to a mental health professional, and you know, the diagnostic categories are not mutually exclusive. It's very tricky and opinion based. It's truly an art to diagnose somebody, and people can have more than one diagnosis. A lot of the symptoms overlap, and so the diagnosis that ends up on a record or a chart has a lot less to do with what's really going on for the person. So my opinion of what the diagnosis ends up being, the thing that's the biggest risk factor for people is a history of trauma of some kind. And it's not always asked about in a mental health setting. Unfortunately, we're getting better at that. There's a lot more awareness that trauma leads to all kinds of mental health problems. But often it's the secrecy or the things that are hidden in a person that make them feel like there's no hope for them. So people who are traumatized have a tendency not to want to talk about it, and to feel like it makes them different or that there's something wrong with them, and so that people can't understand or relate to them. And that it's those kinds of feelings that lead to extreme behaviors, whether it's acting out or acting in suicide. Does that make sense?
Yes. And that's an interesting thought, because to me, it sounds like the most important role of the educator is to be open and accepting of any feelings or situations that our kids bring to us, and to not act dismayed or disgusted by things that they say to us.
Yes, I think it's really important to be able to hear kids say things and to believe them. And we can be thinking in our mind, I wonder if this is true, or I wonder if she's exaggerating, or whatever. But to not say that and not let that show, not let the disgust or the skepticism show, is really important. And let someone else figure out, you know, is she exaggerating? Is this true? That's, you know, people need to be believed.
Well, I'm kind of thinking about it in even a broader sense. Like, I remember, and particularly I'm thinking about some of these things with regard to my English classes. I've had fewer instances of it in other classes that I've taught, but in English classes, a lot of times kids will bring things up, and I have said before, you know, that's not really an appropriate conversation for school or an appropriate topic for school. And I'm realizing in our conversation right now that I didn't handle that right. Like, it would have been better for me to say something like, that can be an uncomfortable topic. Let's talk about that, you and I, or something like that. I could have made an invitation. I could have handled it appropriately for that classroom without shutting it down completely.
Right, and saying that's not an appropriate topic for school doesn't shut it down completely. It's possible that it could have been more helpful to say something slightly different, like, well, that's outside the scope of what we can do right now, talk about right now, but I want to check in with you later, or let's make sure we find a place for you to talk about that if you need to, or whatever. You know, I think that can we check in later about that is probably the safest phrase in a classroom setting, because it doesn't like set up anything, and it also allows you to move on, right?
Yeah.
It's an invitation, but you don't have to address it right then.
Yeah, I mean, because kids bring up stuff that, like,
Sure.
and the thing is that one kid's topic that they want to discuss can be some other kid's trauma instigator.
Absolutely.
So that's its own thing.
Its own thing.
It's its own thing. I wanted to circle back, the history of trauma idea. Do you think it can be helpful for teachers to, like, teachers have a lot of time constraints, a lot of time pressure. And so I always hesitate to say it's really important to take the time to do blah, 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 blah. But at the beginning of the year, lots of times we do kind of inventories to find out what kids are interested in and to get to know them a little bit better. And I'm wondering, I don't think it would be appropriate at the beginning of the year because they just don't know that we're a safe place yet. Excuse me, but maybe after a couple of months when the kids know us, within the framework of other questions, such as, like, what has been your favorite thing we've done so far this year? If you could go anywhere you wanted to on vacation, where would you go? Is it appropriate, or could it be helpful for teachers to say something like, has there been anything in your past that's bothered you that might be impacting the way that you learn? Or is there anything that you want me to know to make the class more comfortable for you, or something like that? Like, not necessarily saying, have you been traumatized, but opening a door if they want to tell us that.
I really like the way you phrased those questions. I think that those are good questions to ask. And I guess my only caveat would be only ask them if you feel prepared and willing to address the answers. So, you know, depending on what kind of teacher you are, what kind of class it is, whatever, like if you feel like you can cope with that, if someone does say, yeah, this happened and I'm distracted by it all the time, I keep having memories, and it's what makes it hard for me to focus at school. But if you're able to then, work with that and address it, and you have the time and the ability or whatever, then yes, great questions. Don't ask questions if you don't want to know the answer.
That's, yeah, like lawyers, don't ask a question unless you know the answer, right? I guess teachers are different. Don't ask a question unless you want to know the answer. I'm going to click on this light right now. It's getting dark where I am. I'm in Texas. You're in Oregon. It's still light there. It's getting dark here. So I have one last question, and then if there's any thoughts that you have that you want to add. My question is, can you tell me, in a general sense, why do people commit suicide? Like in general.
In general. So in general, people commit suicide because they're having feelings that they can't tolerate and that they believe are never going to go away. So it's an expression of hopelessness, essentially. Something really, really bad has happened. In their, it might not be objectively bad, even to them later. They might, with some distance on it, they may be like, yeah, wow, I was really overreacting. But in the moment, it feels intolerable and unsolvable. Okay. And so, there's a variability on how acute or chronic that problem is, but it's essentially a hopelessness. Things aren't going to get better, and I can't live like this.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.